Hi guys, what I thought we would do today is quickly run through the second half of Extract from the Prelude, just so that we're all clear on the meaning of the poem and understand the poet's changing relationship with nature throughout the poem. And then we're going to go through some aspects of form and structure, just so that you've got those under your belt if you ever get a question that would require you to write about them. Okay, so this is the second half of Extract from the Prelude. We looked at the first half in our live lesson together, and I sent out those notes that we made. So you should all have a copy of the notes from the first half of the poem. So I'll just read the second half of the poem to you. And we're going to be thinking, keeping that big question in mind now. Our big question was, how does Wordsworth present his relationship with nature? Wordsworth present his relationship with nature. That's kind of the key theme running through the poem. The poet has this very life-changing experience out on the lake, and that's what we've got to look for when we're reading through it. Okay, so at this point he has stolen the boat, he has rowed out into the middle of the lake, and a massive mountain has been revealed to him from behind a peak that he thought was the biggest one. So he's sitting there in the middle of the lake looking at this huge mountain. He says, "And growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent waters stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There, in her mooring place, I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams." Okay, so that's the second half of the poem, and it's kind of describing what happens to the poet after he has this life-changing experience on the lake. So we'll just go through it line by line and do a quick analysis of what's going on here. So here he's talking about the peak, and growing still in stature, that means size. The grim shape towered up between me and the stars. So it's making the mountain is providing a barrier between him and heaven. Barrier between speaker perhaps suggesting then that if it's blocking out the stars, the light, the guiding lights potentially, it is an evil force, because sailors, as you know, use the stars to navigate. So that could be Wordsworth saying that he's lost his way, that this experience with nature has caused him to lose direction. Loss of direction. And still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. So here again, Wordsworth personifies the mountain. He feels pursued like the mountain. He's saying it strode after him, like it walked with purpose after him, with purpose of its own. So personification, that's a key technique in this poem. If you remember one thing, remember that. Of mountain, poet feels pursued. Now that means chased by nature and the natural world. So you can see that there's definitely starting to be a change in his relationship with nature, because earlier on in the poem he's very much enjoying being out on the lake and looking at the light reflected in the water, and he's having a great time. But now he feels like this mountain is running after him. He feels pursued and chased. So that's quite different. And here we've got a bit of Caesura. Remember, that's when you get punctuation in the middle of a line. And the effect of that is to kind of emphasize the fear that the poet is feeling at being chased by nature. Emphasizes fear. He just abruptly stops in the middle of a line. With trembling oars, again emphasizing his fear, he's shaking. I turned, and through the silent waters stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. So again, we can see a change there, because earlier on in the poem, the poet is asserting his dominance over nature. He's pushing his boat through the water with skill. I think he says, let's have a look quickly. He says, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. I struck and struck again. Yeah, so the poet's earlier on in the poem showing us how he's a master over nature, but now he's hiding from nature. He's turning away with trembling oars and stealing, which means sort of moving secretly through the silent water to the covert of the willow tree. That means a hiding place. So he's been cowed by nature and he is afraid. So change. Poet is scared of nature, running away. Now perhaps that's Wordsworth trying to tell us that man cannot master nature. Even if he thinks he can, he can't. That could be the bigger message there. Because just like Krista said in our live lesson on Tuesday, nature is unknowable, it's unmapped. We don't know how big it is, and this poet is just a tiny person in the middle of the lake. There in her mooring place I left my bark. Bark is just another word for boat, just like pinnace, all these old-fashioned words for boat. And then through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. So we can see he's using some emotive language here to tell us about how he's feeling. He's feeling grave, he's feeling serious. He's really been affected by this experience. So that's the overall emotion he's feeling, kind of sadness, quietness in his soul. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. So he's talking about having seen the mountain. He calls it a spectacle, like it was something amazing. For many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of being. So he's really been affected by it in his mind. His thoughts are kind of unclear to him. Thoughts unclear. And he feels like he's being controlled by these unknown modes of being. So he's being controlled by the memory of the experience on the lake. There hung a darkness o'er my thoughts. Call it solitude or blank desertion. So these are key words here. Solitude and desertion suggest loneliness on the part of the poet. He feels a loneliness in his soul and over his thoughts after this experience with nature. It's made him feel small and alone in the world. And that is reflected in the fact that he is tiny, tiny, tiny man alone on that lake at night. And we could argue that that is a metaphor for life, how we're all small people in a very big world. No familiar shapes remain, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. So he's saying that everything that used to be familiar to him is gone. So he's in an unknown land. That's probably more of a psychological thing than real, because obviously the landscape around him hasn't changed. It's more his psychological landscape that's changed. But huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men move slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. Now, again, he could be referring to the mountains here, huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men. But also, remember the context of this poem when Wordsworth was writing. So he's born in 1770. It's about 20 years or so into the Industrial Revolution, but he's writing this throughout his life. And he, just like the other romantics, is concerned with the impact of the Industrial Revolution on society. So these huge and mighty forms could be the mountain, or they could be the factories of the Industrial Revolution. So just like Blake and Shelley, he's concerned with the impact that this is having, and using words like huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men. And were a trouble to my dreams, that's emphasizing the psychological impact that this experience has had on his life. Okay, so that is in essence the second half of the poem. We've thought about how Wordsworth presents his relationship with nature. He's fearful, he's on the back foot, he is running away. It's made him feel small and solitary and lonely. It's impacted his psychological well-being. All of those things we could talk about if that question was asked. Okay, so your task now is to turn to the worksheet and summarise the poet's changing relationship with nature in the second half of the poem. So I want you to do this in full sentences, and there is some useful vocabulary that you can use to help you. So once you've done that, come back to the video and we will move on to the second part of the lesson. Great, so we are going to think now quickly about some aspects of the form and structure of the poem, because often when we're analysing poetry we jump straight into language analysis, which is fantastic, but we need to be thinking about the form and structure. So, as well as being a biographical poem, the extract from the Prelude is also an epic poem. Now, epic poems are usually about extraordinary adventures, and they usually have a heroic character. Now, some examples of epic poetry include the Iliad and Paradise Lost, some really famous poems. Now, it's a little bit difficult potentially to define extract from the Prelude as an epic poem, because the bit that we look at doesn't really contain an extraordinary adventure, and it doesn't really have a heroic character. The poet is kind of on the back foot, on the run from nature, so we wouldn't necessarily describe him as heroic. We could argue that nature is the heroic character in this poem, potentially. So that's the form of the poem. We know it's epic, and epic poetry is also usually really, really long. And we know that this poem is over sort of 400 pages long, which is very, very long for a poem. Moving on, the poem is also written in something called blank verse. Now that means that the lines are written in iambic pentameter. That's something that we'll look at in a second, and they do not rhyme. So we'll just have a quick look back at the poem. You can see that none of those lines rhyme with each other. They're just all random. No rhyme scheme, and it's written in iambic pentameter. Now that is a type of meter or rhythm that we will go into in more detail now. But the fact that it's written in blank verse, the lines don't rhyme, and it's all written as one long verse. don't know if you noticed, but there was absolutely no stanza breaks in the poem. It's just all one long verse, and even if you look at the whole thing, there's no breaks, there's no line breaks, which is quite overwhelming for the reader and perhaps intended to reflect how the poet felt when he had this overwhelming experience with nature. So I'll just write that over here because I think that's a good point. Reflects poet's overwhelming experience of nature. Okay, right, brilliant. So we've got those two aspects of form. It is an epic poem and it is written in blank verse, one long verse with no breaks, which overwhelms the reader and reflects the poet's overwhelming experience with nature. And then moving on to think about the structure. Now, I mentioned iambic pentameter a few minutes ago as a type of meter or rhythm. So that means essentially it's a fancy way of saying that each line has 5 pairs of syllables, so 10 syllables in total, 1 stressed and 1 unstressed. So I've got a couple of examples here, just to have a quick look at, just to make sure that we understand what iambic pentameter is. So I'm gonna number each of the syllables, and then we're gonna think about which one's stressed and which one's unstressed. So there hung a darkness, call it solitude. So there you can see there is 10 syllables, and I read it in such a way as to show you which syllables were the stressed ones. So the first syllable is unstressed. There hung, this is the first stressed syllable, a darkness, call it solitude. So there we go. And I'll just put the brackets around these pairs of syllables. And there you can see there are 5 pairs of syllables. Again, there's a second example here that we can just go through quickly of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. Again, 10 syllables, stressed of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. So there we go, and there are our 5 pairs. So that's a type of meter that poets use quite frequently in their poetry. All of Shakespeare's plays are written in this meter, and it gives the poem sort of a grand and stately air, but also it is one of the things that qualifies the poem to be written in blank verse. So remember, blank verse is no rhyme and written in iambic pentameter. So now we've had a look at some of those aspects of form and structure. What I want you to do is complete this task here, which is to choose the correct definitions of each of these elements of structure and form. So it's just multiple choice questions, and you should be able to do those based on what you've just learned. So go away and do those on your sheet, and then come back and I will go through the answers. Okay, so I've done that by now. So what is an epic poem? Is it a long poem about a hero, a poem about the adventures of a hero set in the past, a poem of over 400 verses? Now the correct answer to this question is B, a poem about the adventures of a hero set in the past. Now we said, didn't we, that it's quite difficult to categorise the Prelude as an epic poem, but that is the form that it takes. So it's nothing to do with the length as such, but we know that all epic poetry is quite long, and it does contain a hero, but also talks about an adventure. And the adventure in this poem is essentially like Wordsworth's journey to growing up and becoming a man and a poet. Might stretch your definition of epic. Man or a poet, but that is what it is. Okay, blank verse. What is blank verse? A poem in which some words are deliberately missing, a poem without a rhyme scheme and no regular rhythm, a poem without a rhyme scheme written in iambic pentameter. We've just gone through this, so I hope that you remembered that the correct answer is C, a poem without a rhyme scheme written in iambic pentameter. The iambic pentameter bit is what makes it blank verse and not free verse, because this B, that is free verse. So you've got to remember that it's blank verse without a rhyme scheme written in iambic pentameter. That A was just a bit of a red herring because blank, obviously, missing. And then thirdly, what is iambic pentameters? Is it a line with 8 syllables, 4 pairs of stressed and unstressed, lines with a regular rhythm and number of syllables, lines with 10 syllables, 5 pairs of stressed and unstressed? So the correct answer for this one is C, lines with 10 syllables, 5 pairs of stressed and unstressed. We'll just flick back here. There we went through those 2 lines and I showed you how they are written in iambic pentameter, labelled all the syllables and showed you all the pairs. This one here that you might have got a bit confused with, lines with 8 syllables, 4 pairs of stressed and unstressed, that is a meter that poets also use, but it's called trochaic tetrameter. Not as common as iambic pentameter, but still it is used in poetry sometimes, but this is the one we were looking for, iambic pentameter. Right, excellent. So give yourself a mark out of 3 for that task there. And the final task before the end of this lesson is for you guys to fill in the gaps in the paragraph below. So I've written out this paragraph which talks a little bit about the structure and form of the poem, and it's your job to fill in the gaps using words from this word bank here. Okay, so have a go at that on your worksheet and then come back and we will quickly run through the answers before the end of the video. Okay, you should have had a chance to do that by now, so we'll just go quickly run through it. Extract from the Prelude is an blank biographical poem which concerns events from Wordsworth's childhood. So we'll have a look at the word bank and we've got autobiographical already. I think the word that goes in there is epic. Remember, the poem's written about adventures in the past and having heroic characters. The extract we study is taken from the first book of the poem, which runs to over 400 pages in length. So Wordsworth intended to write the poem in 3 books, but he only managed to write 2 before he died, and this bit is from the first bit about his childhood. The poem is written in blank verse, so that's the word we're looking for, blank, not free verse, remember, because it is written in iambic pentameter, which means that the lines do not rhyme. Wordsworth writes in the meter iambic pentameter. I put trochaic tetrameter in there to confuse you. I'm not going to write the whole word. Which makes the poem seem stately and important to the reader. Moreover, this extract is also written as one single, you could have verse or stanza, I'll just put verse. You could have had either of those. This gives the reader the sense of being overwhelmed, just like Wordsworth was in The Face of the Mountain. Okay, there we go. That was quite a long video, but we're at the end of it now, so well done, and I'll see you tomorrow.